Among the Hidden, Chapter 4. Luke found out what Mother meant a few days later when he came down for breakfast. As usual, he opened the door from the back stairs to the kitchen only a crack. He could remember barely a handful of times in his entire life when someone had dropped by before breakfast, and each time Mother had managed to send Matthew or Mark up to warn Luke to stay out of sight. But he always checked. Today he could see Dad and Matthew and Mark at the table, and knew from the sound of frying bacon that Mother must be at the stove. "Are the shades closed?" he called softly. Mother opened the door to the stairs. Luke started to step into the kitchen, but she put her arm out to keep him back. She handed him a plate full of scrambled eggs and bacon. "Luke, honey, can you eat sitting on the bottom step there?" "What?" Luke asked. Mother looked beseechingly over her shoulder. "Dad thinks... it's not safe anymore to have you in the kitchen. You can still eat with us and talk to us and all, but you'll be over here." She waved her hand toward the stairs behind Luke. "But with the shades pulled," Luke started. "One of those workers asked me yesterday, 'Hey, farmer, you got air conditioning in that house of yours?'" Dad said from the table. He didn't turn around. He didn't seem to want to look at Luke. "We keep the shades pulled. Hot day like today. People get suspicious. This way is safer. I'm sorry." And then Dad did turn around and glance at Luke, once. Luke tried to keep from looking upset. "So what'd you tell him?" Matthew asked, as if the worker's question was only a matter of curiosity. "Told him, of course, we don't have air conditioning. Farming don't make nobody a millionaire." Dad took a long sip of coffee. "Okay, Luke?" Mother asked. "Yes," he mumbled. He took the plate of eggs and bacon, but it didn't look good to him now. He knew every bite he ate would stick in his throat. He sat down on the step, out of sight of both the kitchen and the windows. "We'll leave the door open," Mother said. She hovered over him, as if unwilling to return to the stove. "This isn't too much different, is it?" "Mother," Dad said warningly. Through the open windows, Luke could hear the rumble of several trucks and cars. The workers had arrived for the day. He knew from watching through the vent the past few days that the caravan of vehicles came up the road like a parade. The cars would peel off to the side and unload the nicer dressed men. The more rugged vehicles would pull on into the muddiest sections, and the people inside would scatter to the bulldozers and backhoes that had been left outside overnight. But the vehicles barely had time to get cold, because the workers were there now from sunup to sundown. Someone was in a hurry for them to finish. "Luke, I'm sorry," Mother said, and scurried back to the stove. She loaded a plate for herself, then sat down at the table, beside Luke's usual spot. His chair wasn't even in the kitchen anymore. For a while, Luke watched Dad, Mother, Matthew, and Mark eating in silence, a complete family of 4. Once he cleared his throat, ready to protest again. "You can't do this. It's not fair." Then he choked back the words unspoken. They were only trying to protect him. What could he do? Resolutely, Luke stuck his fork back in the pile of scrambled eggs on his plate and took a bite. He ate a whole plateful of food without tasting any of it. Chapter 5. Luke ate every meal after that on the bottom step. It became a habit, but a hated one. He had never noticed before, but Mother often spoke too softly to be heard from any distance, and Matthew and Mark always made their nasty comments under their breath. So they would start laughing, often at Luke's expense, and he couldn't defend himself because he didn't know what they had said. He couldn't even hear Mother saying, "Now be nice, boys." After a week or two, a lot of the time, he didn't even try to listen to the rest of the family's conversation. But even he was curious the hot July day when the letter arrived about the pigs. Matthew brought the mail in that day from the mailbox at the crossroads a mile away. Luke had never seen them, of course, but Matthew and Mark had told him there were 3 mailboxes there, one for each of the families that lived on their road. Usually the gardener's mail was just bills or thin envelopes carrying curt orders from the government about how much corn to plant, which fertilizer to use, and where to take their crop when it was harvested. A letter from a relative was a cause to celebrate, and Mother had always dropped whatever she was doing and sat down to open it with trembling hands, calling out at intervals, or "Oh, Aunt Effie's in the hospital again," or "Oh, tisk, Elizabeth's gonna marry that fellow after all." Luke almost felt he knew his relatives, though they lived hundreds of miles away. And, of course, they didn't even know he existed. The letters Mother wrote back painstakingly at night when she'd saved up enough money for a stamp contained plenty of news of Matthew and Mark, but never once mentioned Luke's name. This letter was as thick as some from Luke's grandmother, but it bore an official seal, and the return address was embossed Department of Human Habitation, Environmental Standards Division. Matthew held the letter at arm's length, the way Luke had seen him hold a dead baby pigs when they had been to be carried out of the barn. Luke looked worried the minute he saw the letter in Matthew's hand. Matthew put the letter down beside Dad's silverware. Dad sighed. Can't be anything but bad news, Dad said. No use ruining a good meal. It can wait. We went back to eating chicken and dumplings. Only after his last belch did he turn the envelope over and run a dirt-rimmed fingernail under the flap. He unfolded the letter. It has come to our attention, he read aloud. Well, so far I understand it. Then he read silently for a while, calling out at intervals, Mother, what's awful? And where's that dictionary? Matthew, look up reciprocity. Yeah, that. Finally, he threw down the whole packet and proclaimed, They're going to make us get rid of our hogs. What? Matthew asked. More serious than Mark. He had talked about for as long as anyone could remember. More serious than Mark, he had talked for as long as anyone could remember about. When I get my own farm, it's going to be all hogs. I'll make the government let me do that somehow. Now he looked over Dad's shoulder. You mean they're just going to make us sell a lot at one time, right? But we can build the herd back up. Nope, Dad said. Those people in them fancy new houses won't be able to stand that pig smell. So we can't raise hogs no more. He threw the letter out into the center of the farm table for all to see. What'd they expect, building next to a farm? From his seat on the stairs, Luke had told himself back from going to fish the edge of the letter out of the chicken gravy and looking at it himself. They can't do that, can they? He asked. Nobody answered. Nobody needed to. Luke felt like a fool for asking as soon as the words were out of his mouth. For once, he was glad of his hiding place. Mother twisted a dish rag in her hand. Those hogs are our bread and butter, she said. With grain prices the way they are, what are we going to live on? Dad just looked at her. After a moment, so did Matthew and Mark. Luke didn't know why. Chapter 6. The tax bill arrived 2 weeks later, the day that Dad, Matthew, and Mark loaded the hogs onto the livestock trailer and took them all away. Most were going to the slaughterhouse. The ones too young and too small to bring a decent price were going to an auction for feeder pigs. Luke watched through the vent at the front of the house as Dad drove by in the battered pickup with each load. Matthew and Mark sat in the back of the pickup, making sure the trailer stayed hitched right. Even 3 stories up, Luke could see Matthew's hangdog expression. Then when 3 of them came into the house for dinner, after washing the last of the hog smell off their hands in the mudroom, Dad handed Mother the tax bill without comment. She put down the wooden spoon she'd been using to stir the stew and unfolded the letter. Then she dropped it. Why, she seemed to be doing the math in her head as she bent to retrieve it. That's 3 times what it usually is. There must be a mistake. Dad shook his head grimly. No mistake. I talked to Williker at the auction. The Willikers were their nearest neighbors, with a house 3 miles down the road. Luke always pictured them with monster scales and fierce claws because of the number of times he'd been cautioned, You don't want the Willikers to see you. Dad went on. Williker says they've raised everyone's taxes because of them fancy houses. Makes our land worth more. Isn't that good? Luke asked eagerly. It was strange. He should hate the new houses for replacing his woods and forcing him to stay indoors. But he'd half fallen in love with them, having watched every foundation poured, every wooden skeleton of walls and roofs raised to the sky. They were his main entertainment, aside from talking to Mother when she came upstairs to what she called my Luke breaks. Sometimes she pretended his room needed cleaning as badly as the bread needed baking or the garden needed weeding. Sometimes she just sat and talked. Dad was shaking his head in disgust over Luke's question. No, it's only good if we're selling, and we ain't. All it means for us is that the government thinks they can get more money out of us. Matthew was slumped in his chair at the table. How are we going to pay? He asked. That's more than we got for all the hogs, and that was supposed to carry us through for a long time. Dad didn't answer. Even Mark, who normally had a smart-alecky comment for everything, was stupefied. Mother had turned back to her stew. "I got my work permit today," she said softly. "The factory's hiring. If I get on there, I can maybe get an advance on my paycheck." Luke's jaw dropped. "You can't go to work," he said. He wanted to say, "Who will stay with me? Who will I talk to all day when everyone is outside?" But that seemed too selfish. Luke looked around. No one else looked surprised by Mother's news. He shut his mouth. Chapter 7. By mid-September, Luke's days had fallen into a familiar pattern. He got up at dawn just before the chance to sit on the stairs and watch the rest of his family eat breakfast. They all rushed now. Mother had to be at the factory by 7. Dad was trying to get all the machinery in working order before harvest. And Matthew and Mark were back in school. Only Luke had time to linger over his undercooked bacon and dry toast. He didn't bother asking for butter because that meant someone would have to stand up and bring it over to him, all the while pretending for the sake of the open window that they just forgot something upstairs. As soon as the rest of his family had stomped out the door, Luke went back to his room and watched out the vents. First out the front, to see Matthew and Mark climb onto the school bus, and then out the back, where the new houses were practically finished. They were mansions as large as the gardener's house and barn put together. They gleamed in the morning sunlight as through their walls were studded with precious jewels. For all Luke knew, maybe they were. Hordes of workmen still arrived every morning, but almost all of them worked indoors now. They headed into the houses first thing, carrying rolls of carpet, stacks of drywall, cans of paint. Luke couldn't see much of them after that. He spent more time now watching a new kind of traffic. Expensive-looking cars driving slowly down the new paved streets. Sometimes they pulled into a driveway and went into one of the houses, usually trailing a woman who appeared to be talking nonstop. It had taken Luke a while to figure it out. He certainly hadn't dared ask anyone else in his family, but he thought maybe the people were thinking about buying the houses. Once he realized that, he studied each potential neighbor carefully. He'd overheard Mother and Dad marveling that the people moving into the new houses were not just going to be city people, but barons. Barons were unbelievably rich, Luke knew. They had things ordinary people hadn't had in years. Luke wasn't sure how the barons had gotten rich, but when everybody else was poor. But Dad never said the word baron without a curse word or two in front of it. The people streaming through the houses did look different from anyone in Luke's family. They were mostly thin, beautiful women with form-fitting dresses and heavy-set men in what Luke's dad and brothers called sissy clothes, shiny shoes and clean, dressy pants and jackets. Luke always felt a little embarrassed for them, showing up like that. Or maybe he was embarrassed for his family, that they never looked like any of the barons. Luke preferred it when the adults had children with them, and he could concentrate on them. The smallest ones were always as dressed up as their parents, with hair bows and suspenders and other gewgaws Luke knew his parents would never buy. The older kids usually seemed to be wearing whatever they'd grabbed first out of their closet that morning. Though he knew no one would show up with 3 kids, he always counted 1, 2, 1, 1, 2. What if a family with just 1 kid moved in behind them, and he sneaked into their house and pretended to be their second child? He could go to school, go to town, act like Matthew and Mark. What a joke. Luke living with barons. More likely he'd be shot for trespassing. Or turned in. When he began thinking things like that, he always jumped down from his perch by the vent and grabbed a book from one of the dusty stacks by the eaves. Mother had taught him how to read and do math, as much as she knew herself. "At least we have a few books for you," she often mumbled sadly when she left in the morning. He'd read all their books a dozen times, and even the ones with titles like Diseases of the Porcupine Species and Common Grasses of Our Countryside. His favorites were the handful of adventure books, the ones that let him pretend he was a knight fighting a dragon to rescue a kidnapped princess, or an explorer sailing on the high seas, holding tight to a mast while a hurricane raged about him. He liked to forget he was Luke Gardner, 3rd child hidden in the attic. Sometime around noon, he'd hear the door from the mudroom to the kitchen swing open, and he'd go down and eat at the same time as his dad. Without Mother there were no homemade pies now, no mashed potatoes, no roasts that sent good smells throughout the house. Dad always made 4 sandwiches, checked to make sure no one could see him, then handed 2 of them to Luke in the stairwell. Dad never talked. He'd explain that he didn't want anyone overhearing him and wondering. But he did turn the radio on for the noon farm report, and there was usually a song or two after that before Dad silenced the radio and went outside to work again. When Dad left, Luke went back to his room to read or watch the houses again. At 6:30, Mother came home, and she always stopped in and said hi to Luke before rushing out to do a whole day's work in the few hours before bedtime. Usually Matthew or Mark came up to visit him too, but they could never stay long either. They had to help Dad before supper, then do homework afterwards. And they always had been nicest to Luke outdoors. Before the woods came down, the 3 of them often had played kickball or football or spud in the backyard after school and chores. Matthew and Mark always fought about who got to have Luke on his team, because even if Luke wasn't very good, 2 boys could always beat the 3rd. Now they played half-hearted games of cards or checkers with Luke, but Luke could tell they'd rather be outside. So would he. He tried not to think about it. The best part of the day came at the end, when Mother tucked him in. She'd be relaxed then. She'd stay for an hour sometimes, asking him what he'd read that day, or telling him stories about the factory. Then one night, when she was telling how her plastic glove had got stuck in a chicken she'd degutted that day, Mother suddenly stopped in the middle of a sentence. "Mother?" Luke said. She answered with a snore. She'd fallen asleep sitting up. Luke studied her face, seeing lines of fatigue that hadn't been there before, noticing that the hair around her face now held as much gray as brown. "Mother," he said again, gently shaking her arm. She jerked. "But I cleaned that chicken all—" "Oh, sorry, Luke. You need tucking in, don't you?" She fluffed his pillow, smoothed his sheet. Luke sat up. "That's okay, Mother. I'm getting too old for this anyway." He swallowed the lump in his throat. "Anyway. I bet you weren't still tucking Matthew or Mark in when they were 12. "No," she said quietly. "Then I don't need it either." "Okay," she said. She kissed his forehead anyhow, then turned out the light. Luke turned his face to the wall until she left.